Beautiful spot.
Yeah, alhamdulillah. Okay, let's recite Surah Al-Fatiha. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وآله وصحبه ومن والاه. اللهم يا منور يا فتاح نور قلوبنا بنور معرفتك وافتح لنا أبواب حكمتك وانشر علينا خزائن رحمتك إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وإخلاصا وصدقا في الدين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. وصل اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Alhamdulillah, welcome back to Getting Our Minds Right. And for those of you who this is your first time in this course we called it Getting Our Minds Right, in that we look at all of the components that go into constructing our worldview as Sunni Muslims, looking at it insofar as the way that we think about theology, and the way that we think about law, and the way we think about spirituality, and then the frameworks that make up the structure by which we come to understand what our tradition ultimately is and how we engage it. And interestingly enough, last week we talked about Aristotle. So you might be thinking, why would you talk about Aristotle? Well, because there are elements of the Aristotelian tradition that are ultimately going to integrate into the way that our tradition functions and understands certain key questions about life, in particular, the way that we engage epistemology. Right? So we also looked before that at Plato, and generally speaking, the Neoplatonic tradition that is also going to, at some level, integrate into the way that Muslims are going to engage the classical and post-classical period of theology in particular. So these concepts are concepts that our ulama grappled with in the same way that everyone who was intellectually engaged in that time period would have been grappling with these questions. And because our tradition was a tradition that was founded on ilm, i.e. knowledge, and that it was going to root itself on the basis of knowledge, it took these questions very serious, and it didn't really care all that much where they came from or didn't come from. Now, obviously, it becomes a factor when you're thinking about what is external to your tradition versus what's internal to your tradition. But at some level, you have to think about it through the lens of whether or not the objectives are similar. And if those objectives are similar and the ideas come with their proofs, i.e., they can justify necessary truth claims, and there's precedent within your own tradition for these ideas, then generally speaking, this was going to be something that Muslims, by and large, were going to be much more capable of integrating, right? Does that make sense? And so, there have been certain critiques, for example, even from amongst Muslims, like Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, said that, there were many Sunni scholars in that late classical period who were more or less obsessed with Aristotle and Plato to the degree that they kind of based their entire system on the ideas of Aristotle and Plato. And many of the ulama of Ahl Sunnah took what it is that he said and in many ways threw it back at him by saying, well, it's true that they engaged with those individuals, but they also sifted from those individuals what was going to be damaging to the tradition and integrated within it what was going to be beneficial for the objectives that Muslims had internal to their own tradition. And even when you look at the way in which kalam as a discourse is going to continually develop, these are things that Muslims by and large we're going to be interested in. The doctrines that we hold them to be things that we believe, and they're true. And we are able to establish them on the basis of knowledge. So how are you going to do that? Well, they come up with this system. And that's more or less what the program that we're looking at in this course, all right? So we just talked about Aristotle. Kind of a recap from last week. Aristotle is a type of empiricist. So in that, observations of the particulars is where he begins. And it's the starting point for him because it's nearer to him. It's, that which is capable of sharing insofar as the way that we engage an understanding of reality, the broadest spectrum of knowledge, and it's something that's tangible. And from there, then, he's wanting to try and grasp the essences of things. But to him, you don't begin by contemplating or abstracting the grander issues in the way that Plato, for example, would have engaged this tradition. You begin by observing specific things. So, for example, I see 50 tables in front of me, and I begin to contemplate on what binds them together. I can see what's common in them, what comes and goes, what's accidental and what's essential. And through various ways of forming definitions and so on, we have some sense of reality of the essence of tables. So you don't get into the reality of things before you look at these basics. Now, how do you come to know the basic universal propositions? Like, for example, if you are beginning with particulars, how do you come to definitions? Well, if you have an inductive process, then your definitions are not going to be certain. So Aristotle seems to believe that the basic starting point for demonstrations for certain knowledge are conceptualizations and propositions that hold some type of primary truth. So for example, the whole is greater than the part. That's a primary truth. It's something that you can reflect on, abstract, and you're able to grasp that that is a conclusion. It's a necessary truth claim. And so on the basis of something like that, he says we can build something from this very basic point in ways that allow us to arrive at other forms of knowledge that are also then going to be necessary truth claims. So this becomes the starting point for the Islamic philosophers, i.e. the falasifa, as well as Sunni theologians, which will then become elaborated and developed in certain ways, all right? And that brings us then to the curriculum. Let me share the screen so that people online can also see what we're seeing. So this is the curriculum. Let me just talk a little bit about this. We touched upon the translation movement that happens during the Abbasid period. There was, we didn't spend much time on it, but there are references for people who want more information about this. Part of the problem that we have in history is due to the lack of documentation from Mesopotamia at exactly the rise of Islam, we're not really sure what the curriculum of the Near East, for example, was. But we can give a sense of what the curriculum was for the Greek philosophical tradition by and large. All right, Assalamu alaikum, welcome, welcome. There are people who have written on this, academics like Dimitri Gutas and others that I think you can reference if you want more of an understanding of this. Generally speaking, yeah, can we make room? Welcome, welcome. So generally speaking, philosophy, both Greek and the Islamic tradition, is going to consist of two parts. The first is theoretical, or nadari. And theoretical philosophy has two branches, what's known as physics and then metaphysics. في الطبيعة وما بعد الطبيعة, or ما وراء الطبيعة. So physics is the study of the natural body insofar as it undergoes change. and they thought of metaphysics, which was also called first philosophy, as the study of being qua being. It's okay if you don't understand that. We'll talk a little bit more about it. So that's theoretical. Oh. I guess I don't need. Nah, yeah. Inshallah, we'll tweak this when we get to it. Practical philosophy consists of three parts. Practical philosophy is seen in the Islamic tradition as being those elements that one can arrive at change through. So unlike theoretical philosophy, where the aim is knowledge, knowledge of a thing is different than the practical elements of a thing in that you're actually doing something, right? So for example, we all here believe that there's one God, correct? Alhamdulillah. Did we do anything? What did you do? You didn't physically do anything, but you have an internal action of the heart that assents to that proposition. There is one God. That's a belief, that's something that we would put within the realm of theoretical philosophy. Practical philosophy are that sort of range of topics that are affected by the external elements of one's life. Okay, so within this sort of branch of philosophy, there are three primary divisions. The first one is ethics, and it's really interesting too because you get at the etymology of some of these terms. So ethics comes from ethos, which means nature or like the disposition. Okay, so it's defined as the management of the soul. This category is going to have some influence on the Islamic intellectual tradition in works, for example, of people like Miskawayh, as well as Imam al-Ghazali, especially in the Iqtisad and in his text Al-Mizan al-Amal. Economics actually comes from oikos, which means house. Okay, so this was seen as the management of the household. This has very little influence on the Islamic tradition. And then politics, which comes from two words, polite, which means citizen, and then polis, which means, city. So it's defined as the management of the city. Okay, this has some light influence on Islamic thought via Plato and some of Aristotle's works, although again, they're not really going to depend on this whatsoever. So the practical elements are used then in sequence from ordering the management of the self, which will reflect the right type of management of your household, which will reflect the right type of ordering or management of the city. Does everybody see that? And that's the way in which they thought of this particular hierarchy. In other words, from the very beginning, the point of practical philosophy was a way to give order to an entire system where human beings are seen as the smallest microcosm and reflect outwards and upwards to the greater macrocosm. And this idea will be replicated in Islamic philosophy, aspects of tasawwuf within Islamic spirituality, and a few other Islamic disciplines as well. Practical philosophy is called practical, like we said before, because it deals with things that one can change with one's actions. All right, so theoretical philosophy is to get at what it is that we know. Practical philosophy is to allow for that thing that we know to affect us in this world, right? So for example, theoretical philosophy could be the question of what is the good? Whereas practical philosophy is getting at the question of how do we produce good people, all right? So for example, in this sort of grid that we've placed here, one's actions on their soul, the self, will have an effect on how one orders their intellect as opposed to, let's say, their irascible faculties, their animalistic desires, okay? Economics has to do with actions that happen in your household. And then politics has to do with actions in a polis, in a city, the virtues that are related to living amongst one another, as Aristotle said. So this is a science where the praxis or the actions are going to have an impact on the world, and you can bring things about through your actions. And that's the most important part of this. So theoretical philosophy has nothing to do with actions. You know, for example, you can't change the laws of physics by your actions, and you can't change the nature of the universe or metaphysics by your actions, versus the side of practical philosophy. Does everybody understand that now? Okay. Now, what precedes the subject of philosophy itself and is regarded as the tool, the ala of philosophy in Islam, and will act as the premise of most of the theological works in the classical period of Islam as well, is logic. Okay. So before you do any theoretical or practical philosophy, you have to do logic or mantiq, all right? Which brings us to the trivium. Now, when we look at logic, the derivation from within the Islamic philosophical tradition is what's known as the Organon of Aristotle. So it's called the the instrumental sciences, or the tools. And ala in Arabic means the tools, okay? So these were disciplines that were seen as tools for Muslims in building civilization, and ultimately insofar as the way that they were going to engage their civilizational tradition. So the first one is mantiq. And mantiq was seen as that discipline or art that preserves sound thought, in order to ensure that you have a system of reasoning and rationality to arrive at truth as opposed to falsehood. That's what logic was for them. It was also a tool used to understand philosophy. So logic, like I said before, was studied prior to theology or philosophy. And logic in the Islamic tradition was articulated not as part of philosophy or theology, it was only a tool. It was an ala. Even though the Muslims referred to logic as a tool, they actually oftentimes would treat it as having its own subject matter. And maybe that's the reason why it causes a lot of confusion amongst people. The second is grammar, nahu. Again, a science in the vein of logic, was the science that preserved one's ability to speak properly. Okay. There's debate today as to whether or not you even need grammar. Yeah, we're kind of in complete chaos. But obviously, grammar, I mean, these topics, as you'll come to see, are topics that happen organically, in the sense that they are a part and parcel of human nature. The only difference to what we're presenting here and what happens on a normal day-to-day basis is that this is codified. It's providing you a systematic approach of understanding what happens naturally. All right. So the way that I'm speaking to you right now, you're able to make sense of it because we have rules of grammar. Does that make sense? All right. Rhetoric then, or ilm al-balagha, is seen as the art of persuasion. And so, you know, there's a very famous debate that will ensue between two scholars, al-Matta and Sirafi, and it's going to be about the usefulness of logic and some of these other topics. So they said, for example, if you have Arabic grammar, do you really need logic? Like, do you really need Greek logic? Is logic not reducible to certain laws of language at the end of the day? But logic in the Greco sort of Arabic tradition goes off into its own discipline and is going to be studied by people like Al-Farabi and Al-Kindi, the son of philosophers. And later, it's going to be examined by Sunnis, and Imam al-Ghazali has a lot to do with streamlining it into the tradition, generally speaking. Again, sifting from it what was going to be problematic, and then bringing into the tradition what ultimately was part and parcel of the tradition itself, and becomes a codified approach of being able to deliver on those objectives within our tradition, right? Does that make sense? All good? There is going to be debate as to whether or not logic is permissible or impermissible. And Imam al-Akhdari in his Sulam talks about it. You know, he says that there are certain people who very famously object to it. So it's going to be debate. But like I said before, by and large, you're going to find that the majority of the tradition are going to be using logic. The quadrivium, sort of the other aspect of the ulum, the instrumental sciences, they really are topics of mathematics. So you have, for example, arithmetic, which is the science of numbers which are discrete. So like 1, 2, 3, 4. Then you have geometry, which is the science of numbers that are not discrete. So like extensions and things. Then you have music that was studied, which was ultimately seen as the science of numbers in ratio. Okay. Somebody who's taken a music theory class, you really see this when you take music theory. Yeah. It's filled with this. And then astronomy, which is the science of numbers of things in the sky insofar as they're in motion and changing, right? So they're calculating things as they are in motion. That's the quadrivium. Now let's, for really quickly here, get into logic. And that's going to make up a bulk of what it is that we're going to actually talk about today. Typically, the Islamic intellectual tradition would focus their studies on logic, as well as physics and metaphysics, when we look at, again, what is really going to influence the normative, orthodox, sort of Sunni tradition, insofar as what this Greek philosophical tradition has to offer. It's logic, it's physics, and metaphysics. And as you'll come to see, their physics is also going to be something that is more or less going to be marginalized, and then their metaphysics, to a much larger degree, is going to be marginalized. The practical sciences were not really important for them because the Sharia has its own sciences that dealt with those things. So we have fiqh, law, we have usul al-fiqh, which is a methodological science, okay, kind of like a legal method in philosophy. Tasawwuf, as it relates to ethics and psychology, and kalam as it touches on politics. And kalam, theology, actually, the initial conversations around politics in Islam, you're going to find them in the books of theology. All right. Does anybody know why? What were some of the initial issues that happened within the ummah that brought about even the theological discussions that we talked about in some of the first classes that we had?
There were major theological issues from the very beginning.
And what were they?
That the Sahaba directly took from the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam.
Yeah, so that's more kind of like a technical thing. But what's the general? Where did it sort of stem from? What was it? Who should lead? Who should lead? Who should be the next Khalifa? Right? And then all of those matters that relate to the establishment of the Khilafah, the Caliphate of the Muslims, which is going to be central and something that is going to be discussed by many. Juwayni has a huge text looking at this particular concept. So that's really where the initial conversations are going to happen, kind of like in political theory within books of theology. For the Falasifa, this curriculum was seen primarily as doctrine, to be understood and then advanced. Whereas for the Mutakallimun, the theologians, it was seen as kind of a communal obligation for us to study these things in order to respond to it and to enrich our Kalam tradition, which studied the same subjects of epistemology and metaphysics, but from a perspective that was grounded in revelation. So you remember when we talked about the fact that the real difference when we looked at what the philosophers were doing in contrast to what the theologians were doing is that the theologians were grounded in revelation, and that they saw revelation as being fundamental to this whole venture of life and what it is that we're supposed to do and finding purpose. The mind, the intellect alone is insufficient at giving you an understanding of what you are supposed to be doing. All right? Not insofar as the certain basic ideas of God and that he's one, so on and so forth, but rather insofar as how you cultivate a complete conceptual theory of existence and what your purpose is to that. So how do you arrive at the fact that heaven and hell are really true things that we as Muslims have to confront after we pass away? That's something that can only be known vis-a-vis revelation, or that angels exist, right? Or all of the events that are going to happen on the day of judgment, so on and so forth, or that there even is a day of judgment, right? All of these things necessitate revelation. So that revelation is a must for the mutakallimun, and their starting point is revelation, meaning that they approach the source text of Islam vis-a-vis usul al-fiqh, this methodological science of how we approach our source text, to derive from the source text what we believe, as well as what it is that we're supposed to do and who we are supposed to be as human beings, right? Like what the standard of embodiment really is. And then from there, these sciences that were developed, like kalam, fiqh, and others, are then going to provide a systematic approach of understanding how all of that is going to be engaged and understood. And from the perspective of theology, there are things that you have to believe. We derive them from the Quran and Sunnah. And then theology goes one step beyond that and says, and here's why those beliefs are true. In other words, here's why you are able to know for certain, with certainty, that these things that you believe as Muslims are absolutely 100% true. And why beliefs that go against these particular beliefs are false. And that's going to be an imperative. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself made it an imperative. فَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. Have knowledge that there's no deity except God. That's a statement about reality. And so that statement ultimately has to be addressed within the realm of epistemology, or coming into an understanding of how we know the things that we know, grounding these beliefs in certainty. Medicine was also going to be studied from within this tradition. And we talked a little bit about the humors last week and these kinds of ideas. It influenced certain notions of what the soul was as well, which is going to be found in physics, but it wasn't a proper facet of the curriculum per se. The last thing to know is what you notice after the 11th century is that Muslim scholars working on kalam, as well as law and legal theory, would be trained in all of what preceded, okay, due to the curriculum in the madrasas. And this includes, by the way, the madrasas and the madrasa system in Andalusia, in the Ottoman world, in the Safavid Iranian world, in Mughal Indian world, later in North Africa. This is also going to have a huge impact. So in other words, it's not like these are sciences that people that are engaged in philosophical, theological discussions per se are the only ones who are really investigating. No, even usuliyun, like the usul fiqh scholars, okay, legal jurists and the sort of legal philosophers within our tradition are also going to be engaging this tradition in this way. All right. So it's important to understand the kinds of effect that it's going to have. Now, the Organon consists of a number of different books. The ones that I've listed here, we can go through quickly. The first book that Aristotle puts in is called the Categories, what in Arabic is known as the Maqulat. Categorain is a statement that means to assert something, or a statement, right? Which is what a maqula is as well, a statement. And so these are discussions of the categories of existence. Like something can exist, they said, as a substance, as a quality, as a quantity, etc. And there are 10. Okay, there's like these didactic poems that we would have to memorize in order for us to know what these 10 things are. زيد الطويل الأبيض ابن مالكي في بيته بالأمس كان متكي. It's like a really weird poem. Everybody understands Arabic. They're like, what is this guy saying? Zayd, the tall one, Ibn Maliki, the son of Maliki, And what it's doing ultimately is it's showing you, okay, Zayd, substance, Tawil, quality, right? Ibn Maliki, the Nisbah, so on and so forth, the different types of categories that there are. Now, the Islamic tradition was generally going to be rather uncomfortable with placing the categories into the field of logic. Like for them, it seems to be a question of metaphysics, but it was passed on to them through the discipline of logic. And so, at some level, they're grappling with it. But as you'll come to see later, they are going to say, look, logic isn't really interested in these kinds of topics, like what exists and what doesn't exist. To go into those questions per se, go into the advanced books of Kalam. Right? But for example, you'll find that there are going to be questions that have to be dealt with in order for you to ground the concepts within logic that you're going to be dealing with. All right. And as they'll come to then have discussions on later within the books of Kalam, whether or not the natural universal exists or not, so on and so forth, quiddities being extramental or not, the question of quiddities in the mind corresponding exactly to what exists extramentally, yada, yada, these kinds of things. And they said that these questions are not really proper to logic. On interpretation, which is the study of semantics, okay, words are put together into sentences and how these sentences are to be interpreted. So like how certain phrases could be contradictory, etc. And these are basic propositions or statements. And then once you have statements, you get into the prior analytics, okay, which is formal logic. This is concerned with the formal rules of reasoning. This is what we're going to go into today. Okay, so for example, the very famous, if every A is B and every B is C, then every A is C, right? So you're not concerned with the details. A, B, and C could be anything, right? What you're concerned with is the structure, including modes. For example, they also look at, so how do you argue about the conclusion when the premises are possibility premises? Like for example, if it rains today, then I will buy an umbrella. So does possibility as a modality transfer, and what are the proofs, etc. And then posterior analytics, okay, which is the material logic. This is demonstration, when you have premises that are necessary in themselves and rules that are necessary, can you and how do you derive necessary conclusions? That's what we're going to get into, inshallah, a little bit. Not today, we'll see how much logic you guys want to do. All right. Formal logic concerned with the form of argumentation, material logic concerned with the kinds of conclusions that you draw. In the real world, obviously, arguments are such that the formal aspect of argumentation are filled with certain material propositions, and those propositions have a value. So for example, you can have statements about God that say, God is necessarily one. Okay. You can have other kinds of statements as well, some that are more convincing as opposed to not as convincing, like saying, if I see someone with my enemy, then that person is my enemy. Well, there's nothing certain about that, but it could be true, okay? The point is material logic is concerned with the kinds of conclusions that you're going to draw once you fill those formal aspects of the argument with particular types of propositions. And then from there are the other 5 books. We don't have to get into it, inshallah. The Muslim tradition, by and large, elaborated on these books after interpreting and translating them. And one of their main foci was the prior analytics, and especially modal logic, the logic of necessity and possibility, which is going to become extremely important when we get into theology, right? And that's the reason why we're going through all of this, is that you have to come to an understanding that the way in which we are arguing for the positions that we're arguing for in Islam are based on these realities. And so in order to ground the claims that you're making as Muslims, you have to be able to exhaust this. Now, not everybody, obviously, but as a science, that's going to be the basis upon which all of the other sciences derive their basic axioms from. Okay, what we're talking about is usul ad-din. Like theology was called usul ad-din, the foundation of the religion, the whole religion. You have to make sure that the basis of your entire religion then is something that is absolutely firm. And that's the reason why they went into this type of detail. Does that make sense? Okay. I think we should break and pray, and then we'll come back and do logic, inshallah. All right. صلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Inshallah. You know how I know everybody's really ready for this? I took a break. There's a lot of people on this side of the room that I haven't met. I'll introduce yourself. What's your name? Yonina? Ronina. With an R.
Yeah.
Mashallah. What kind of, where's that from? What,
I don't know. I've never met any people that speak the Arabic.
and Zara? Razan. Yeah, okay. Ronnie? Rania. Hassan? Hassan. Oh, right. I'm trying too hard. It's like there for me. Hassan, Rania. Do you spell it?
R-O-D-A.
Oh, D. Okay.
So Rodin.
Rodina. Got it. Rodina and Roseanne, that's right. Roseanne. MashaAllah. Welcome, welcome. It's your first time here?
Yeah.
MashaAllah. Welcome. If you're thinking, what's going on in this class and why is this guy talking about this stuff, you're in the right place. That's usually what happens in classes. Inshallah, you come back. But you know, there is a good tea, and the people here are really good people too. So, inshallah, you know, do you live in the area? Aina? Aina. Nice to meet you. Okay. I think. Okay, we were talking about logic and we set up kind of the basic framework for logic. Now, we could really go deep here if we wanted to. And I think that I had talked about doing a logic class in the past and I never actually did it. Yeah, maybe we do logic class. Yeah, it's been was it you wanted to do it back in the day too? Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, we'll definitely schedule a logic class for the upcoming courses, inshallah. And it's really important that Muslims, particularly in the day and age we live today, have a solid understanding of at least the basic stuff. And this is kind of what I'm going to try to give an understanding of today, inshallah. Now, logic texts in the Islamic tradition and otherwise are going to oftentimes begin in very similar ways. When you look at a classical logic book, you'll find that the discussion within the Islamic intellectual tradition, for instance, will say that knowledge is of two types. You have al-qadim and al-hadith. You have knowledge that is eternal and knowledge that is incipient. And what they mean by this is that when we talk about knowledge, which is going to be fundamental to the initial topic of logic, we have to distinguish between God's knowledge and our knowledge. God's knowledge is eternal, it's perfect, it's complete, right? It's not affected in the same ways that our knowledge is affected, and so we're not talking about that. Then there's knowledge that we have, i.e. contingent knowledge or incipient knowledge. Okay? And that's the discussion then that we're going to be having from this point forward. So they'll say that that knowledge is primarily delineated into two. You have concepts or tasawwurat, and you have tasdiqat, which are a sense. Okay? What are concepts? So for example, when I say a term like tree, okay, I say that term and all of us have an image that is obtained in the mind. Probably that image is going to have maybe particular features that are not going to be the same particular features that are in my mind, right? And all of us still understand what it is that we're talking about. Okay, so at some level, you could say something like this. Going to be, or don't judge me. Okay. Something like that happens in the mind. We call that a conceptualization. Okay. Now, ultimately, what ends up happening from there is that you're able to take these concepts and expand upon them in a variety of ways. So concepts are either a jins or a nawah or a fasl. So you have a genus or a species or properties or accidents. What they mean by accidents here is a technical term used in philosophy to basically just mean a type of property. And so you're able then in the mind to grasp these things. And I say firas. In the mind, we grasp something. Human being. I say dog, cat. All of these things ultimately bring about a conceptualization in the mind for all of us. Okay. Now, propositions consist of concepts, and they're either categorical or hypothetical. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But propositions come together in a certain form to produce conclusions, okay? And this form is called a syllogism. So for example, all S is P, X is S, and then the conclusion is X is P, okay? Now they can come together like this in one of four figures, all right? And they're going to, again, from the building blocks of logic, break this down for you. They're going to say that you can either have an A, an I, an E, or an O. It should really be A and E first, and then I and O. Not even, we'll change it later. An A type is a universal and affirmative, so you can say something like, all philosophers are mortal. Then you have a particular and affirmative, some philosophers are mortal. A universal negative, all philosophers are not mortal, and then some philosophers are not mortal, which is a particular negative. Okay? Those are the different figures that you can have within this sort of basic building block that we've created. Now, from there, what the logicians are going to want to figure out is whether or not these particular figures and the way in which we organize them can ultimately bring about conclusions that would be true. Okay? Insofar as what? Insofar as the form, not the material. And this is, again, we're going to stress this and I'm going to come back to it. So if you don't get this, stay with me. Each syllogism, okay? So this is a syllogism that we have up here. Each syllogism has three terms. You have a major term, a minor term, and you have a middle term. So in our example here, for example, the major premise is all birds are animals. Okay? The minor premise, all parrots are birds, brings about a conclusion. All parrots are animals. Okay? So the middle term is going to be the term that comes up in both the major and minor premise. What is that? Bird, right? The bird is there in the major premise, and birds are there in the minor premise, right? Now, from this, the assessment that the logicians make is to say, there's some universal rules that seem to be part and parcel of every one of these types of figures. And we can basically conclude that all of them are going to act in this way. So for example, in this syllogism, the conclusion will never be the same as the premise. Okay? The middle term gets dropped and it will not appear in the conclusion. And one premise will give you your subject and one will give you your predicate for the conclusion. Those are rules that are going to stand within each of these, right? The other thing that we see here is that these types of syllogism, okay, so this is one type. This is a universal and affirmative, as we talked about the 4 different figures, okay? This figure is a universal and affirmative. Now we see that there are going to obviously be various moods then that are productive, i.e. they work, okay? So if we said, for example, all B are A, and all P are B. Is the conclusion going to remain if we follow the same symbols that we put for each one of these concepts? Yes. In other words, it doesn't really matter what's there. Formally, it will conclude properly if they are organized properly. And so the logician said is that, okay, for each figure, like for this one, for example, there are going to be a finite set that work within each figure. And so it's up to us then to understand what all of those are, right? So for example, in the A type, which is the universal and affirmative, there are going to be 4, okay? And this is one of the ways in which they show it, okay? These are the 4 productive moods, as they call them, okay? The 4 classifications of the syllogism that will work irregardless of what you put there. So long as they're consistent, they will work. All right? Now, there are other rules as well that they realized are going to work universally. So for example, when you have 2 positive premises, you're going to have a positive conclusion. When you have 2 negative premises, you'll have no conclusion. When you have 1 negative and 1 positive premises, you're going to have a negative conclusion. All of these things then begin to standardize a very codified understanding of how these rules work. All right? So for the A type, which is the universal and affirmative that we just looked at, there are 4 moods. For the I type, you're going to have 4 moods. For the E type, you're going to have 5. And for the O type, you're going to have 6. Okay? The rest of them are not productive. In other words, they don't work. Okay? From there are things that ultimately are called contradictions and converse or counters, aks in Arabic. And then syllogisms can come together and produce more complex syllogisms, and then you can use these tools in your construction of arguments and analysis, for example. All right? Does everybody understand what has been said here? Okay, great. You're all logicians.
Where did you derive the 4 moods, 5 moods?
Yeah, that's where those are things that are standardized in the discipline. And they know like these are the finite set of moods that are going to be productive within each of these figures. And so it becomes a very mathematical understanding of how you arrive at true conclusions. Now they're true insofar as what? They're true insofar as the form, like we said before. Okay. When we say something like S is P, right? We don't know what S is or P is, but we're simply saying that you can fill in those with those symbols anything, and you will have a way of coming to form syllogisms. When you form those syllogisms, so long as they follow these rules, if the premises are necessarily true, the conclusions will necessarily be true. Does that make sense? And so that's really what they're after at the end of the day. All right? Now, here's what's really important also in this discussion. We said that we have concepts and we have assents, supposedly called. Okay? So when we say, for example, that a particular proposition is built of concepts and a relationship between concepts, what we're actually getting at is, I could say Theros, I have a conception of Theros. and I can say logician, and I have a conception of logician. And then I can say Firas is a logician. And I also have a conception or a conceptualization of what that means, that relationship between Firas and him being a logician. And all of us are able to come to that same conceptualization, right? Now, when we have put two concepts, two conceptualizations into a relationship with one another, okay, we call that a judgment. We call that a what? A judgment. Okay. Based on that judgment, or what is also a proposition, it can either be something that is true or not true. How would you know? There has to be some kind of proof. There has to be some evidence that allows for you to know whether or not that proposition holds or does not hold. These judgments and this classification of understanding is going to be the central classification that the mutakallimun and usuliyun are going to use in our intellectual tradition. As Muslims, when we say, for example, God exists, that's a proposition, correct? And we say that you can actually have knowledge of that it can be grounded properly in a way that allows you to say that I know that. What you're not saying, and what the mutakallimun were not saying, was that we know what the essence of God is. Or even that we know what the essence of existence is. What they're saying is that they have a basic apprehension of God insofar as what he is and what he's not, okay? What that term is referring to. And they have a basic apprehension of existence. We know what it means to exist. And we have an understanding, a conceptualization of what it means to say God exists, what it means to predicate that subject with that particular predicate. And so when we say it's true, we say it's true insofar as the nisbah, insofar as the relationship that those two things have with one another. Why is this important? This is important because we will never know what the essence of God is. And yet we can still know with absolute certainty that he exists. Why? Because our understanding of knowledge is not that we come to understand the reality of a thing as it is. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to say anything about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because we will never know what the reality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. Does that make sense? This model, and this particular point, by the way, is an extremely important point. People doing work in this field, you know, I can't tell you how many times they make errors when it comes to this issue. That's what the mutakallimun are doing. Oftentimes you'll hear a critique that, you know, people that are doing that, they're trying to like figure out the essences of everything. Like they want the essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Hopefully what I just said to you right now will allow you to know that that's absolutely not true. And if anybody says that, maybe you can say, hey, there's this thing that this guy said one time at this place. I know it's not true. I don't know what he said exactly, but I know it's not true. Right? If you want more information, you can go to Irvine. It's a place, it's really hot. And they have good tea and good coffee there. Figure it out. All right. Everybody good? This is an important point for me, especially because, again, it's going to come up later. Now, let's look at some examples. So we said that we're interested in arguments, okay? What we're interested in trying to do is construct and also deconstruct, classify, have an examinational capacity for what is being said and how we can come to understand whether or not those things are true or not, right? Now, we said that arguments consist of two parts. You have premises and you have conclusions. There's a relationship between the premises of an argument and the conclusions, which is that the arguments are offered in support of the conclusion such that the conclusion is set to follow from the premises. So to follow up on epistemic terms, the premise of an argument are supposed to be reasons to believe the conclusions. And so an argument is not just a random set of sentences that are thrown together, but a set of sentences where there's some kind of relationship between sentences, which are premises, and then the sentences which are conclusions. And the premises are supposed to give us some reason to believe that the conclusions are true. Now, using this gives us a way to talk about inductive and deductive arguments, because they're going to have a different kind of relationship in support between premises and conclusions. Many people here have studied some of this before. You know the difference between an inductive and a deductive argument, for example. All right, so what's that? This programming language, yeah. So engineers here, for example, gone through this. Also, people that have just done general degrees in mathematics have probably done a lot of this. Okay. Now we generally classify arguments into deductive and inductive. Okay. A deductive is moving from a general premise to a specific conclusion. So, for example, you can say all dogs are animals, so my dog is an animal. Now, induction can be seen to move in the opposite direction. Okay. So, inductive is moving from a specific premise to make a general conclusion. You know, you could say something like, my Egyptian neighbor is rude, so all Egyptian people are rude. I'm Egyptian. It's okay. It's not true. All right. It's a generalization. It's shocking how much of this happens in our society, like kind of hourly, maybe even less basis. You ever watch the presidential, what are they called? Get on the mic and I'll talk to you. Is it? The debates, yeah. They're filled with these things. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule, okay? People over the centuries have shown that some deductive arguments don't have general premises and don't necessarily move towards the opposite. And, you know, one is more sort of suited with mathematical sciences, one can say, and i.e., like they start with universals, moving to particulars, and another is more suited to something like biological sciences, okay, where you move from particulars to universals. But the point that they're trying to make is that if the premises are true, okay, the conclusion is going to be true, right? And an inductive argument, what they're saying is that if the premises are true, the conclusion is more likely to be true, but it still could be false. So suppose you wanted to prove, like they did, this is the classical example, that all swans are white. How would you do it? Right, so you would, now this is an inductive argument. You're going to go look at all of these swans. And like they did, they're going to say, well, every single swan that we've ever seen is white. Therefore, all swans are white. Now, is that actually true? It's not. It's not true. Okay. In the pre-modern period, it was a fact that they believed in, but then they came to realize, what's that exactly? Right. So they exist in Australia, which is why they were relatively unknown to the Western world for so long, by the way. A group of scientists from the West went to Australia, saw this group of birds in the distance, and they asked, like, what are those? They captured the birds. Grabbed it, went and like tested their DNA, and then they concluded, they're actually swans. Since not all swans are white. So it can be true that every swan that I've seen thus far is white, but then I come to see a black swan and I realize, that's not actually true. Right? Not all swans are white. So knowing that the premises of this argument is true, an inductive argument is true, doesn't guarantee that the conclusion is going to be true. And that's a hard and fast rule. However, if the premise of a deductive argument is true, then the conclusions must be true. Okay? So they would say an argument is valid when it meets this requirement. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So the example that we have up here, all men are mortal. Okay? Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is immortal. Does that follow? Is it true? Absolutely true? It's absolutely true. Okay. Now, what Aristotle noticed from this is that validity was due to the form that the argument took. And that's what we talked about a little bit. It's not what the argument is about. The argument is valid due to the way that the terms are distributed. So if we replace these terms with letters, it's still going to follow and we're still going to end up having a valid syllogism. Okay, yeah.
Going back to God is one. So I guess like the essence of something doesn't need to be known in that sense.
Yeah.
So that's like a hard.
This is a huge debate in our field. It just depends on what you mean by essence. Okay,
That's
so
a realization that you have in your mind is not, like fully realized, I guess.
exactly, it's not like the haqiqa of the thing itself is basically what they're trying to say. Okay, and we'll come to we'll try to come to parse this. There's a reason why they said this. So, for example, this gets treated in the Creed of Imam al-Nasafi for Muslims as well. If we wait till we get to the theology portion, you'll see. His first line in that text, it says, حقائق الأشياء ثابتة والعلم بها متحقق خلافا للسفسطائية. The reality of what, it depends on what you mean by حقائق here, okay? So that's what the first discussion is going to be. The حقائق of things are affirmed. And the ability to know them is real, basically. In contradistinction to the sophists, i.e. the people who were skeptics or nihilists or people who, thought that I don't know if I exist or you exist, or this is all just born a dream, we're just all living like Inception, you're Leonardo DiCaprio, I don't know, these kinds of, crazy things. So what they're really saying is, no, you have an understanding that like you're real and you are a human being, and this is a table and it's real, I'm not dreaming, okay? Versus this sort of more grand philosophical commitment that they said is meant by essences in the sense of like essentialism, okay? Where you are what you are because there's some eternal essence, okay, that exists that necessitates that you are this way and necessitates that your relationship to other things has to also be necessarily that way.
So what do like what constitutes belief in that sense? Because like that's kind of
what constitutes belief
in general, right? Like if you believe that the truth that it's like haqa'iq, right? And then like not questioning them or like not being super philosophical about them, that leads out this belief, right?
No. It's on this question, it's simply to say, another way of saying it is, did God create that essence and the relationship that essence has with all other essences? Or is it something that exists without the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and has to follow necessarily in a particular fashion that it does? That's really what they're trying to get at. Like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can create an essence, destroy it, create something else, destroy it. He can create the relationship that we understand vis-a-vis this essence, and when we know that it holds, he could also choose not to create that relationship. Like fire burning. Fire burning is the classical example that we give. Okay. Does fire necessarily burn? Does fire necessarily burn?
Yes.
No, not because I did that. But why do they say that? They say that because they said, first of all, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran reveals that Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam was thrown into the fire, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Kuni bardan salaman ala Ibrahim. If you believe that fire necessarily burns, you have a problem with this verse, like Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd had. Ibn Rushd had to, finesse that understanding a little bit. He said, well, it doesn't actually mean that he was thrown into the fire per se. What was actually happening there was that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created an inhibiting cause around the fire that Ibrahim alayhi was thrown into. And ostensibly, what have you done? You've changed the meaning for sure.
Preserve the essence of the fire.
Well, you've gotten rid of miracles, right? Because there's no one. What's a miracle now? So yeah, so I'm not saying like you don't follow the patterns that are in the world, but you have to recognize that these are not necessary relationships, right? Like when I let go of this pen, it's probably going to fall down. We know, and we're going to assume that it's going to fall down, and that would be a good assumption, right? And we're going to live our lives in a way that it is going to fall down. Yeah, alhamdulillah. Can you imagine if it didn't? Like, I always feel like at one point I'm going to do this and it's not going to fall down. And I'm in history books for sure. So we assume that relationship. But it's different than there's a difference between empirical normativity and something being rationally necessary. Okay? When I say rationally necessary, I mean that if we were to assume the opposite, a contradiction would arise. Okay, and insofar as that is concerned, we wouldn't place that or posit that in relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah doesn't create a world that has contradiction, right? And then expect us to be able to have knowledge and arrive at Him. You know what I'm saying? Nothing would make sense at that point. So, what they're doing by saying essences, they believe in essences, and they believe that things have, these types of fixed realities in a sense. Okay, that's what allows me to know that you are a human being and not a tree. But there's a difference between saying that and saying that those essences are things that are pre-eternal, right? Have to be the way that they are, and that necessitate a behavior with other things on the basis of what they are, which is all like sort of an additional component that is put into an understanding of essences from those things, right? Anyways, back to logic. Aristotle's logic. So this is a classical sort of presentation of categorical logic, and that's what Aristotle's logic is really all about. It's categorical because it deals with categorical statements about categories of objects. Okay, so he was interested in those four kinds of propositions. All A's are B's, no A's are B's, some A's are B's, and some A's are not B's, right? And he went through and categorized it in the way that we've shown now. Now, there's a variety of arguments that we can look at, and we can come to an understanding as to whether or not those arguments are valid or not, right? And that becomes the first step. So, for example, all Republicans, all basketball players are humans. All basketball players are vampires. Okay. Some basketball players come out during the day. So some basketball players come out during the day. No, no. I'm sorry. Some vampires. Yes. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Some basketball players are vampires. Sorry, all basketball players are vampires. Some basketball players come out during the day. Therefore, some vampires come out during the day. Is this argument valid?
No.
The premise that you created. If I accept the first part.
Exactly. Good. It is valid. Valid meaning what? Meaning that does that syllogism follow properly? If those statements are true, would that be a true statement? Yes. Okay. If the premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be true. Now it just happens to turn out that it's false. But if they were true, then the conclusion would have to be true. Okay. So what is the form of the argument ultimately? That's the first sort of topic. Right? All A's are B's, some A's are C's, so some B's are C's. That's ultimately what we've said here. That works. Okay, it's productive. And you can see that this arrangement must preserve truth no matter what A, B, and C stand for. Okay, like one says everything that isn't A is also a B, and if it's really true that some A's are C's, okay, then it would have to be the case that some B's are C's, right? So on and so forth. Now, the validity of an argument is independent of the truth of the argument's premises. So a sound argument is a valid argument with true premises. So only valid arguments can be sound or unsound. An invalid argument is never sound. And the way that you work these problems out looks at the form of the argument to verify that it is valid. Okay. Then you determine whether the content of the premises are actually true. Are they actually sound? Okay. And it's perfectly ordinary for a valid argument to have false premises, as in the example that we just gave, right? And what that means is that it's not sound. Like, what is not allowed is for a valid argument to have true premises and a false conclusion. And so you can test for validity, which becomes, again, the point that we're trying to make. And then from there, you want to look at the material of the actual premises themselves to determine whether or not those premises are necessarily true or not. Does that make sense? That becomes sort of the basic framework that we're going to be looking at when we look at logic, formal logic in this way. Okay. Some other examples that we have: all men are immortal. Socrates isn't a man, therefore Socrates isn't immortal. What's wrong with it?
That's fine. Because it doesn't like Socrates is like a big man. You're not fighting anything about Socrates. It's like it's not for
So can you construct a counterexample?
Socrates. That part of immoral, therefore he's immoral.
Nice. All right. This becomes then the role that they're also looking to try and bring into these arguments to see whether or not a counterexample would in fact deny the very basis of the argument being made. So can you construct a counterexample to this argument? Yes, right? So you try and think of a scenario where the premises are true and the conclusion is false. This is easy to do. I mean, perhaps Socrates is the name of my dog, right? It could then be true that all men are mortal and true that Socrates isn't a man, but false that he isn't mortal. Okay. So this argument form is invalid. There's a lot more that we can look at here. There's a set of like practice examples that we can go through. We're going to be done with logic though. Inshallah. Hopefully now you have some framework to be able to understand the types of things that we're about to do when we get into the next section, looking at the arguments that are going to be produced, particularly the arguments that are going to be put down by the falasifa, and then the rebuttals of the mutakallimun and what the mutakallimun, the theologians of Ahl Sunnah, are going to put down, and why we come to know what it is that we know within our tradition is sound and is absolutely true within a methodology that works properly and allows us to make the types of claims that we're trying to make verified. That's the whole sort of project of Kalam. It's the building blocks of the tradition, hence why it becomes extremely important for all of us to have some level of understanding of this. Inshallah, we'll end here. So, any questions, comments, objections? Yeah.
Going over the forms, what is particular? You find like the types of thoughts, but like when you put like particular and affirmative, what's particular?
A particular, so when we're talking about, think of those examples that we gave. Some philosophers, Socrates, Aristotle, I don't know many modern folks. So there's some particular, right? That's what particular is. Yeah.
I guess later we talked about like how scholars use right, prove certain things, right? Yeah.
What comes?
Syllogisms.
Yeah, so yeah. Right.
I guess for syllogism to work, input has to be necessarily true, right?
No. Again, you have to separate between the syllogism working and the statement itself being true.
Or I guess, no, sorry, I have to state it, but I guess for syllogism to have a sound conclusion,
Yeah.
input has to be necessarily true.
No. No. You don't even have to know what the input is. It just has to follow the particular categorizations that are known in these figures that arrive at sound conclusions. And so long as you know that they follow, they're going to be sound. But that's different than saying what they are stating is true. Okay, so there's two points here. The first is whether or not the premise is actually true. That's what you're talking about. Okay? The other is whether or not the propositions that have been ordered into a syllogism is valid or not. And so in formal logic, what they're trying to do is they're trying to say, look, is this as a formal figure, okay, something that produces knowledge, yes or no? And what they mean by knowledge here would be that it's a valid syllogism. All A's are B's. All B's are C's. Therefore, all A's are C's. Do you know what A, B, or C is? No. But is what I just said true? You see? So that's what they're trying to figure out is, whoa, okay, that's a true statement, even though it doesn't really mean anything per se. But we know it's true. Now, when you fill A, B, and C in with some material objects, at that point then, you're going to have to assess whether or not what is being stated is true or not. And if you have necessarily true premises and a valid syllogism, you will have a conclusion that is necessarily true. Why is this such a big deal? Well, yeah, that's true. But why is it a big deal for us as Muslims, like, and the tradition that we carry? And it's like, why did they take this so serious? Yeah, because what they're saying is, look, we believe in God and we believe in everything that our religion tells us to believe in. And we're not doing it because we woke up one morning and found ourselves in a Muslim household and thought, okay, I guess I'm going to do this. We believe in this stuff and it's true. It's real. This isn't a game, you know. This is real. And these beliefs that we have are absolutely true. And there's absolutely no way to deny it. It's not a probability. Like the way we talk about it in modern discourse, it seems to be like, look, I'm an atheist, I kind of have faith that there is no God. You're a believer, you have faith that there is a God, and we'll kind of see where we end up, right? No, that's not what's happening here, bro. Okay? What's happening is the belief that I have is a belief that's grounded, necessarily true. And what you have is necessarily false. And there's no ego in this. It's just, it is what it is. I wouldn't say like, look, you know, half of two is one. I believe that, and if you don't believe it, then I have faith in what I have, and you have faith in what you have. We don't talk like that. There are things that are true, and there are things that are false. There are things, obviously, that, yeah, there's some gray. And that's no problem. We believe that, and there's a certain type of subjective analysis that we have in our own lives. And, okay, that's great. But the fundamental truths of reality, no, those things have clear, true, false statements that have to be deliberated on. And there isn't like, oh, I have faith in this thing, and I'm just riding with it. So when we say believe, like I believe that God exists, sometimes belief is a little bit an ambiguous term. It's used to mean things that we don't actually mean when we say it within our tradition. It's like, I believe that the Lakers are going to take it this year. Inshallah. When I say I believe in God, I'm not talking about belief in the same way that I'm talking about belief that the Lakers are going to take it. When I say believe in God, I mean I know that He exists. I know for certain that this is real. There's no other way. That's what belief means in that context. And that, again, this shows us why understanding our tradition from within our own internal discursive understanding of that tradition is extremely important. Because the way that people talk about it in pop culture is very different than the way that we talk about it. Now, I know that there's hesitation in that, particularly in the time period we live in today, because anytime that you say that something is objectively true, it's made to seem like you're trying to establish your dominance over this group of people or this person, or like you're trying to like establish authority and power. The whole world is going to reduce down to these power dynamics and whatnot. That's problematic. Right? That's one of the problems of critical theory. But that's part of the project that we have then as Muslims, is to say, okay, that's a reality. How do we deal with it? Well, we definitely don't deal with it by simply just putting our head in the ground and assuming that it doesn't exist, or trying to make sure that whatever it is that they say, whoever they are, fits into the way in which I, as my own person, my own set of beliefs and structures, understand my own tradition. Oh, if they say this, then I have to try to make my tradition fit into that. No. We have to try and find a way to establish what it is that we know, and to know them properly, and to be unapologetic about those things, and then to engage it in a way that is indicative of the way that our Prophet ﷺ engaged his own society, with love, and mercy, and care, and concern, like real concern. He was really concerned. It's one of the things that we know about him. Even now. قد جاءكم رسول من أنفسكم عزيز عليه ما عنتم حريص عليكم بالمؤمنين رؤوف رحيم. Like the Prophet is really troubled when you're troubled. When he sees somebody struggling, he struggles. Like that should speak to the way that we engage reality, like the world around us. When we see people struggling, even when those people were really, really mean to us, it should still trouble us at some level. So, that becomes more or less a process of application, how we understand the way that our tradition applies in these very nuanced ways with wisdom. This is the reason why the wisdom tradition is something that we have to like recapture and revive. Some people know it intuitively. Like some people are just better at this than others. But you should know that there is a way that has been codified within our tradition to help us understand how to do this properly. Some people said that the wisdom tradition is a tradition that simply just allows you to know as a human being, when to take a step forward and when not to. When to say something and when not to say something. A person may actually come to you and ask you a question and you know the answer, and you don't give them that answer. Why? Because you know that that's not what they actually need. The only way that you can do that is you're able to empathize with them and to really sit in what it is that they're going through and have an understanding of how that works. Right? So the things that we're talking about in this class oftentimes can seem a little bit dry, and I don't want us to get confused as to like what the project is. Like we know how to make sense of all of the different issues that we come into contact with on a daily basis from our theological lens, okay? Including the problem of evil. But there's a difference between knowing the right answers in this sort of analytic sense and a person coming up to you and saying like, hey, this really, really horrible thing happened to me and my family, and you being like, oh, I have the answer to that. Well, that's someone who doesn't know like that they shouldn't have said anything at that moment, right? So inshallah, Allah gives us an understanding of our religion to be people of wisdom, and people of truth, and people of kindness, and people of love, and people of service. اللهم لك الحمد حتى ترضى، لك الحمد إذا رضيت، ولك الحمد بعد الرضا، ولك الحمد الذي نقول وخير مما نقول، ولك الحمد الذي تقول، ولك الحمد على كل حال. اللهم إني نسألك الهدى والتقى والعفاف والغنى، اللهم استرنا بسترك الجميل، اللهم استرنا بسترك الجميل. اللهم إني نسألك العفو والعافية والمعافاة في الدين والآخرة. اللهم يا الله يا الله يا الله، بجاه اسماء الله وصفات الله، اقضي حوائجنا ظاهرا وباطنا، نصر من الله وفتح قريب، وبشر المؤمنين. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه، وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم ارزقنا حسن الخاتمة. اللهم أعنا على ذكرك وشكرك وحسن عبادتك. يا عالم السر منا لا تهتك الستر عنا وعافنا واعف عنا، وكلنا حيث كنا، واجعل آخر كلامنا لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله عدد كمال الله كما يليق بكماله. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله. Barakallahu feekum. Sorry for going over today, but we're kind of in a weird time period right now. We're cutting in the middle. So inshallah, that will end soon. We'll be able to not have to break like that. See you all next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Sheikh, I have a question about